Welcome to this lovely room at the Zeta Hotel. Last week, some of you were here. We were at the Karl Marx Memorial Library and Workers' School around the corner, which is a slightly more austere environment, a little more serious with strip lighting on the ceiling. Some worthy books about Marxism were on the shelves. And they rang up earlier in the week and said they'd had a flood, so we had to try and find somewhere else. And so we called the Zeta, who we've worked with a bit, and they said, fine, come down here. So this is what capitalism feels like compared to last week. That's what socialism felt like. I really like it. So it's rather confusing. Flo said that last week it was socialism, this week it's champagne socialism. So thanks to the Zeta for having us. It feels a bit more like a sort of Peaky Blinders gathering. But we may come back here next week, I'm not sure yet, we'll see. But at the moment, we're still back at the Marx Library for anyone who's coming back for talk number 3. So what I'll do, as last week, is I'll speak for about 45 minutes. Flo is going to give me the sort of 5-minute sign. And we're filming that bit. And then we'll have another drink or a break and for 10 minutes or so. And then sit down for another 40 minutes just to discuss what I talked about in the first half. So that's the symposium side. As you probably know, and this is a more comfy room and probably a bit more like the original Greek symposiums. I think I mentioned last week what they basically were, but symposium means with life or in company. The Latin word convivium comes from that, and obviously our word conviviality. And the symposium was an invention, or at least it was popularized in ancient Athens, which was a city of about 100,000 people, which gave birth to the most incredible sort of philosophical movements the world has ever known, which is still with us today, which we talked about last week. So we talked about Socrates, we talked about, if you remember, the Stoics, the Cynics, the Peripatetics, the Aristotelians, Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, and the skeptics as well. And the fact that these movements came from really this one person, Socrates, who actually did very little with his life. He was the ultimate idler. I mean, he just walked around the streets annoying people, and he didn't even bother to write anything down. And then we compared him, and he wore very simple dress. He was an anti-consumerist, so he went into the market and said, look at all this stuff I don't need. He said that your wants could be very simple. It's wrong to sort of chase wealth and status and so on. He was humble in that he said, I know nothing. I'm going to find out about the world by asking questions. And he taught people by asking them questions, by being quite annoying. And he was so annoying that the Athenian state had him killed. And there were lots of parallels with Jesus Christ, because this is another person who wandered around in very simple clothes, who asked lots of annoying, difficult questions, who annoyed people, who didn't seem to work. He certainly didn't write anything down, but he was one of those people who had such a huge effect on the people around him that other people wrote down what he said, and clearly became an influential figure, even more influential than Socrates. So it was fascinating to me that these people who certainly didn't work hard, we talked a little bit about the work ethic as exemplified perhaps today by somebody like Elon Musk, who says he got to work 90 hours a week, he sleeps under his desk, nobody ever changed the world on working 40 hours a week. So this is the sort of thing that we're competing with as philosophers, if you like. So the idea of philosophy is that you make an effort to make some time to do nothing, or to stare out the window, to think, to be with friends, or to do something like this, a symposium. So welcome to part 2. Tonight we're going to be, sorry, I'll just start that again. If I pause, it's because I said something stupid for Dave. So I'm just going to start it from scratch, if that's okay. So welcome to part 2 of this symposium series. And tonight I'm going to be talking about developments in idling from the time of Christ to the present day. Now, in the last session, we looked at what I meant by idling. I don't mean that you give up on life and you're lazy and just watch telly all day. But there's something, I argue, that's very good about doing nothing, and which can lead to creative breakthroughs, which can lead to scientific breakthroughs, breakthroughs in your own life. Doing nothing is very good for the health. It's very good to not work. It's a corrective against overwork. And synonyms for idling might be contemplation, meditation, prayer even, also partying, reading, studying. So it's that whole part of life that I want to support and look at. And the first era we're going to look at, well, let's just go a little bit backwards to the first Symposium, when we looked at the ancient Greeks. And one of the features of the ancient Greek philosophical movement was that they started really a kind of a proto-monastery movement. So they started these places, the Academy, the Lyceum, Epicurus' garden, places where people could go and get away from the hurly-burly and talk about ideas and philosophy. Some of this was based on trying to understand physical phenomena. Are there atoms? What's a star? What's the moon? Does the moon go around the Earth? Is it the other way around? How big is the world? And so on. What's lightning? What are clouds? So these were interesting topics of discussion. And then with Socrates, they also introduced the idea of the good life. How should we live to be happy? And can we find happiness? And that was a new kind of self-consciousness, but also a new sense that you could sort of take control of your own life through philosophy, rather than just being sort of tossed around. But these retreats spread around the Mediterranean, and there were dozens of Epicurean-type communes around the Mediterranean called the Garden. Virgil lived on one, wrote poetry there, and they were quite popular, quite a trendy thing to sort of retreat to. But they started to, and Plato's Academy carried on for something like until about 400 or 500 AD, subsequent versions of it. And these were like monasteries. And in fact, this whole philosophical movement, in a way, sort of mutated into the Christian monastery movement. And that replaced it in many places as people became sort of Christianized. So this is kind of what was going on in the Christian world in sort of 400 to 1000 AD, which we often call the Dark Ages. I don't actually know that much about it. St. Augustine was around then, and he was a little bit like Socrates, and he was very philosophical. He probably would have been a philosopher in ancient Greece. You probably remember he was absolutely addicted to shagging in his early life, and he was the one who said, "Let me be chaste, but not just yet." And he had concubines and mistresses and so on. And but then he became the Bishop of Hippo later in life, and he invented the idea of original sin, in fact, which is quite an unpleasant idea. But he was sort of a philosopher. So what I really want to talk about is coming into the Middle Ages, and what was the dominant sort of ideology, if you like, of the Middle Ages? How did people actually think and live? What were their priorities in life? And how that changed radically in the Reformation, and then changed again radically during the Industrial Revolution, and is possibly changing again now with the Digital Revolution. And each step, I'm going to argue, was a sort of attack on idleness. So for the very early Christians, firstly, medieval culture, the economist or historian Juliet Shaw, who wrote a book called The Overworked American, she's done studies that show that medieval people had far more days off than we do today. And it's wrong to think that the medieval period, I'm talking about roughly 1,000 to around 1450 or something like that, the medieval period leading up to the Renaissance. It's a mistake to think that period was somehow unsophisticated, that everyone was sort of slavish, uneducated. In fact, the average peasant had quite a large measure of independence and lots of days off. And we can see evidence of this in old books about the manorial system in the UK, where you would have a contract as a kind of mini smallholder, have a contract with your lord. And it was certainly true that there was the lord of the manor, there was a lord, but the peasants sort of voluntarily put themselves under the protection of a law to protect them from marauding barons and so on. This is one version of the tale. And so people came together in these sort of villages, and you had to do a bit of work for your lord in return for your small holding and your farm, perhaps 2 or 3 days a week, and you had to give them a chicken at Christmas or whatever it was, a fatted capon, 6 eggs and so on. But people had a surprising amount of days off and also autonomy. So the days off came largely through holidays and feast days which were organised by the church. So Christmas was 12 days. If you've read or heard of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is the great medieval English poem about a sort of big party at Camelot with the lords and ladies having a lovely time dining and feasting and playing games for 12 days at Christmas, and this party is interrupted by the figure of the Green Knight. That's an example of a sort of, maybe slightly fanciful, but an example of what medieval Christmas was supposed to be like. Literally 12 days of feasting when you wouldn't work. You went back to work on Plough Monday, because that's the day you could start ploughing the earth, which would be sometime in early January. So winter certainly was a time for no work. You couldn't really work, it was too cold. Virgil says winter is the farmer's lazy time. So then you had 12 days. But these festivals and holidays cropped up all throughout the year. The creeping to the cross, Easter and so on, and lots that we've now sort of forgotten. So although they were controlled by the church, and you sort of had to take days off when you were told to, and there was Sabbaths and so on, the church did at least allow for a lot of sort of fun and drinking and merriment and so on. And a lot of time for recuperation. And again, they'd borrowed a lot of these holidays, like Christmas was a midwinter feast. Well, there's always been a midwinter feast in most cultures. It makes a lot of sense to have a midwinter feast and do nothing, just have fun when it's really cold and raining outside. And you bring any greenery you can into the house and light the candles, so you light up the indoors and have fun. And then that sort of mutated into Christmas, but there was something called Saturnalia in pagan times in Greece and Rome. And there were lots of days in Greece and Rome when you weren't allowed to, for example, fight. You weren't allowed to transact business. And you had to say your prayers and this sort of thing. So the first feature of medieval society I want to point to is the fact that people didn't work too hard. There was also a sort of theological underpinning of society which stopped people from working too hard and resulted in the institution of the guilds, which I'll go on to in a sec, which is a lovely way of working. By the way, to find out about this, I've just read a pile of books by sort of modern-ish historians like Ronald Hutton, who's a professor at Bristol University. There's some great historians out there, and all medieval historians share this thing, that people have got the medieval period wrong. Because we think we got some kind of Monty Python idea in our mind, that everyone was basically a slave, filthy, there was a constant plague, and you never left your hometown. If that was actually true, then we wouldn't have the evidence of our own eyes. Florence, Siena, Arezzo, Cologne, Westminster Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, sorry, Lincoln Cathedral and so on. There's incredible buildings, for one thing, that were built, and they built them in very, very high, and the standard of architecture actually went down after the medieval period, and it was only when we got back to the Eiffel Tower they could build buildings that tall again. So they were absolutely, Notre Dame Cathedral, amazing feats of architecture and filled with beautiful works, which were made by the craftsmen and the craftspeople of the town, of the city that was building its own cathedral. So most people, not everyone, but the dominant religion was clearly Christianity, and this was medieval Christianity, something more like Catholic Christianity, pre-Protestant. So there was a lot of incense swinging and a lot of praying to icons, lots of saints, lots of female saints. We've been to churches in Italy, you know what they're like, richly decorated, weird little gargoyles on the sides, people showing their arses and genitals, which is a really lovely feature of medieval cathedral statuary. And not just in France and Italy, but all over the place. I mean, we went on holiday to Croatia, and it was a lovely medieval town. And you're just walking along and there's a sort of little medieval guy like bearing his buttocks at you with his genitals hanging out. And I mean, that's perfectly normal. This fun with ribaldry, lack of prudishness would go alongside these spiritual experiences that you would have going into the church. So I think it's just such a fascinating period. So I want to talk about Jacques Le Goff. Jacques Le Goff he only recently died, the French medieval historian. So he said, and why didn't people work as hard in the medieval period? They did work, and clearly they came together to produce fantastic cloths, clothes, stonework, carpentry, and so on. The reason why William Morris and the arts and crafts people loved the medieval period was because they were very, very craft-based. And they're very interested in creating things of beauty, as well as objects, as well as the religious art. But the religious thing that I want to mention is Jacques Le Goff says there was a sort of general belief in some kind of fate. They also, by the way, loved Aristotle, so there was a kind of pagan Greek vibe in medieval society. And these translators of Aristotle had come through the even more sophisticated Arab scholars who loved Aristotle, translated Aristotle, and then you would hang out with the Christians, and there would be symposiums, and eventually these Arab translators were translated back into English. And you had Thomas Aquinas, who was the sort of great theologian, and he tried to kind of combine the sort of ethical stuff in Aristotle about how you live a good life with the Sermon on the Mount, or with sort of Christ's teaching. So again, very sophisticated. They invented the university, Oxford and Cambridge are medieval institutions, Paris, Bologna, and so on. And Jacques Le Goff says to work hard could be seen to indicate a lack of faith in God's providence. So what he means is, you shouldn't overwork because God doesn't want you to. If you overwork, it could be a sign that you're sort of becoming like Dr. Faustus or Trump. You're overreaching yourself, you're working too hard, and you're almost sort of rivaling God. And you should just work the sort of allotted hours, which are daytime. So obviously there's no night working in the medieval period. And also, to overwork would be seen as an act of competitiveness with your brother in the guild. Okay, so today in the modern office, the culture and advertising kind of sets you apart from your neighbour. You compete against him or her for a promotion. You leave your jacket on the back of the chair. You come into work when you're ill. You try and be seen to be working harder than the other guy. That's the opposite of the medieval system. In theory, anyway, by the way. I'm not saying it was always kind of harmonious in practice. But the theory was that you should not work harder than your brother in the guild because you were in a fraternity, which was called a guild, and that was your union, if you like, your sort of trade association. So if you go to Florence, there are postcards which show there were 21 guilds in medieval Florence. And they would have been things like the apothecaries, There were also the bankers' guilds, the money changers. Banking was a big thing in lots of Italian cities. Clearly the Medicis were big bankers. Genova was another sort of banking centre. So there was sort of this pre-capitalist systems of trade and money around as well. And the guild would look after you if you were ill. And it would look after your family, and there would be a sort of common fund. And we all know there are guild halls still in London, which are paid for by the proceeds of a common fund that you sort of pay into. So this is a sophisticated system, I think. The other thing about it, the medieval system, is that it was based around city-states. So there wasn't quite the same idea of a nation, and one city-state would compete against the other. But what's fascinating in terms of Marxism and the radical thinkers of the 19th century was that the democratic systems, again, were quite sophisticated. So Kropotkin, who writes about these city-states, he's the great anarchist the great Russian anarchist of the 19th century. And he said these city-states are almost like a sort of anarchy in action, or a sort of communism in action. It's all about the commune. Still today, they're called il comune. And if you go to an Italian city-state, they often still have the weekly meeting, which has been going on since 1250 every week or whatever. So there's a sense that life is lived as a collective and in a group. And And so there's a big guild hall where you all eat together. Bread ovens are communal. There were communal baths where you go. And these baths were also where the sort of sex and prostitution happened. You go to cathedrals, life is lived sort of outside in the street. We're brothers and sisters as Christians, you know, and we're all sort of equal. And the other thing people forget about this period is that the medieval Christians abolished slavery, which had obviously been a feature of a pagan world. The Greeks and Romans had slaves. Gradually, slavery was abolished because the Christians felt it was wrong to... It came back later, but in this particular period, slavery was seen as wrong and more or less wiped out. Again, a sophisticated system. Finally, so what I'm saying was there was more time. Obviously, you know, you had to go to church. There's more. The church supplied not only these days off and the feast days, but also the holy days, where obviously you would go and listen to sermons. I think churches in those days, you stood up, and they were quite bustling places where there'd be shops and things going on. You didn't sit down. It wasn't quite as reverential, but there'd always be some kind of sermon going on. So you had the opportunity to be sort of uplifted and taken to some other place. The other thing is that it was felt that your salvation came through good works. So if you were told to be charitable and to give to the poor, this also had the effect that beggars, i.e. do-nothings, were not seen as a kind of drain on society, but they actually played a role, and people were quite happy to have beggars around, because if you gave them money, it would help you to get to heaven. So they were playing a social role. So beggars weren't exactly an object of pity or an object of sort of you know, attempts at correction, or let's try and find this person a job. They were sort of part of the fabric of society. Also, there were the wandering monks. So another example of a kind of idler of the medieval period, probably the most famous, would be St. Francis of Assisi. So at the time, as well as these, you know, sort of quite harmonious. The downside was that there was a lot of actual physical fighting and battles between these different towns. The medieval battlefield was a pretty sort of gory place. But still, you sort of think it wasn't on the scale of the Second World War or the First World War, you know. These are quite small skirmishes by comparison. Yes, they were bloody and brutal, but, you know, the historians say that I could be tending my sheep in one field and there'd be a bloody battle going on 2 fields away, and the two worlds coexisted. It wasn't anything like the sort of devastation genocides of the early to mid 20th century. Okay, so what other good features are there? Well, there was the ban on usury, so lending money at interest, although it definitely did happen, certainly in commercial world it happened, and there were sort of various complicated financial instruments, a bit like now. But in general, the preachers preached against lending money at interest, giving a loan and charging money at interest. And it was seen to be sort of, you know, disreputable, like Wonga. So a couple of disreputable money lenders come into the street. They take advantage of the poor people by lending them money at ridiculous rates of interest, and they make a lot of money out of this. So we still have this sort of instinct that Wonga is, you know, something like Wonga, payday lenders are wrong. But they would have extended it so that, you know, it would have been wrong to lend money at interest to anybody. Partly because you were, again, that person who's poor, well, that situation's been created by God. You know, it's just their sort of bad luck. It's not necessarily because they're sort of indigent. I mean, people did complain about beggars as well, but this was an idea that was certainly out there. You know, the beggars are part of society. It's not their fault. God's put them there. And poor people, and so if you lend them money, you're taking advantage of your brother's destitution, if you like, and that's wrong. Lend them money and charge interest. You can lend money without charging interest. That's something different. And the Bible's full of these anti-usury statements. So that was taken very seriously. There was something called the Brethren of the Free Spirit. So lurking underneath this, underneath medieval Christianity, there were these heretical movements which came under the banner of the Brethren of the Free Spirit. And these were people, the kind of gangs who would like go from town to town, sort of whipping themselves. They would come into the town. They tended to be comprised of men and women of all different social backgrounds. So they were like sort of bohemian gangs. and like the Bloomsbury Group or something, and they refused to work. That was their sort of, so they were the ultimate idlers. And they said, we don't need to work because we will find bread. Give us bread for God's sake. But they also, again, fulfilled a social function. They looked after the poor, and they started an institution called the Beguinages. And they were called the Beguines and the Begards. They were like sort of lay religious people. And you can see these places in Belgium and France now. They're still sort of there like almshouses. And they removed themselves from society a little bit. It didn't work. Somehow got paid, I don't know how. And they were the social workers. They went out and helped people. But this, in general, the Brethren of the Free Spirit was seen as something quite sort of heretical. And St. Francis of Assisi, who I mentioned, his idea was to create a wandering order of monks. So the Dominicans were, stationary. They lived in monasteries. But they should be a wandering order, like these Brethren of the Free Spirit, who just wander around doing nothing, like Indian holy men, saddies today. And so they were seen as holy people. But the Pope said yes to St. Francis. This is not such a bad idea because it's going to kind of incorporate these heresies and make them kind of acceptable to me and the Church. Now, obviously, everyone knows the downside of this whole system was that it became extremely corrupt. So towards the end of it, certainly. So I'll just finish quickly by saying they were very pro-merriment, certainly in the UK, very pro-feasting. The churches had parties, like raves, called church ales, where they sold the beer. I understand from Roland Hutton, Professor Hutton, that the early church fathers were like, he said the Bible is not a party lover's manual. And the early church leaders were sort of quite anti-fun and anti-sex and drugs and rock and roll. But as the medieval period wore on, they become much more lax about it. We'll let people have fun. In fact, let's give them the fun. We'll sell the beer, have a party in the churchyard, and we'll make money from the beer, and we'll build another church with this money. And there was lovely fun customs like the maypole. So the maypole, which was like medieval Tinder, and this is how you meet people outside of your immediate social group. So the young girls and boys would whirl around the maypole. Different people would come in from a wider area for that village's maypole party, and you sort of whirl around and sort of work yourself up into this sort of frenzy of lust in May. And then people would go off into the woods and have sex, because there was much more outdoor sex in those days, because the houses were smaller. Also, there weren't corridors, so you had to move through each person's room to get to the next room. Corridors were a much later invention, funnily enough, but it's quite interesting. It's sort of 18th century invention. Some grand houses, you just go from room to room to room, like National Trust houses, and there's no corridors. So that's what the maypole was all about, and it was a lot of fun. There were mystery plays. There were, Roland Hutton talks about all these sorts of customs and games and fun that they had, and apple bobbings and what. Some of these customs come back at Christmas, which we call a merry time. So they're very, very into merriment. They're very into hospitality. You got to look after people. The monasteries looked after the poor wandering beggars. They also taught them for free. It was a charitable society. You were sort of virtually forced to be charitable. And people thought that was good, that was going to get you into heaven. A communal society, a sort of reasonably compassionate society. These are all the good things. But at the same time, this, there were murmurings, growing murmurings against this system. One of the great ones was Savonarola, who was the very pious monk. He went into the square in Florence and asked all the fine ladies to throw their mirrors, bangles, all their finery and fine clothes into a big heap and set fire to it. And that was called the Bonfire of the Vanities, which is where the Tom Wolfe book comes from. And these were quite regular things. The sort of rich people would suddenly have this kind of attack of conscience and throw their fine clothes onto the fire and declutter. Exactly the same sort of thing. So it's like a sort of Marie Kondo of the time. It was called the Bonfire of the Vanities. Declutter, you got too much stuff, simplify, get back down to the basics. But this was also starting to happen in a kind of theological way. So, so we have just briefly again, we have the great idler Christ, who says, we need to, don't worry too much about your life, spend a lot of time thinking about getting into heaven. The medieval period, which has these features I've talked about, socially sophisticated, fantastic architecture, amazing artworks, painting, a kind of mystical edge, lots of sort of crazy mystics, St. Francis living in a cave, this sort of thing, wearing simple clothes, a stick, unshaven, a bit like the ancient Greek philosophers, So a lot of the same ideas are kind of whirling around. And these are all, to me, it's basically sort of pro-idling. But there are murmurings. This system, the Pope is engaged in non-stop sodomy. He drinks fine clarets and, spends all our money. They wear purple robes. They have no care for the poor people. And you're being oppressed by this sort of, ecclesiastical class who basically steal your money through things like indulgences. So give me money and I'll get you into heaven. And it's a cataclysmic shift in thinking, which is caused by Calvin, whose word later turns into Calvinism, which is like a sort of definition of a sort of hard-working life, or the idea that work is at the centre of life, and Luther. And Luther and Calvin, in different ways, react against this existing system because they say it's horribly corrupt, people are being misled, the church has lost its way, we need to get back to the basics and strip out all this nonsense. And we shouldn't be praising idols. And we got to. It's become superstitious. People are in this sort of superstitious fog, which is a little bit like what Epicurus said about the ancient Greek religion. Like you can abandon all this superstition. So all the crossing and things like Christmas were seen as superstitious. In England, this idea started to spread. We call it the Reformation, and preachers started to appear saying, this is all nonsense. And they were first called Protestants because they were protesting against the existing order. And then out of them sprang a kind of what Walton calls the sort of stormtroopers of Protestantism, who were the Puritans. So the Puritans were all black as a kind of protest against the kind of lavish purples and bright colours of the medieval period that medieval people like motley. When you see the gesture in Motley, that was kind of a real thing. People did dress up in these very complicated clothes, excuse me, and had really elaborate feasts. So, at the centre of the medieval dining table, they would bring in a re-feathered goose with gold painted onto its beak and its feet. So they had this incredibly sort of theatrical, and then the blackbirds flying out of a pie. That was the kind of just the kind of thing that would have happened at a very sort of theatrical medieval dinner. And there were some perhaps less savoury aspects to the medieval thing, which was cruelty to animals. So we know about bear baiting and cockfighting, and these were sort of medieval pastimes. And the new Puritans and Protestants were also against those. So there was kind of something a little bit good about it, but one commentator said, well, the Puritans banned bear baiting because they had this suspicion that someone somewhere might be enjoying it. So the Calvin and Luther gave birth to this sort of Puritan Protestant reaction against the excesses of medieval Christianity. And they were very successful. What happened in the great cataclysm of 1535 in this country was that Henry VIII got together with the Puritans, and he sent his Protestants around the country, literally smashing up the old churches and stealing all the gold and silver plate and stuff that had been in there for 500 years. The gargoyles were seen as idolatrous. The maypoles were taken down. This is a little bit later, but the maypoles were seen as a sort of stinking idol, hopelessly superstitious. As the Reformation sort of gained traction, if you like, first, Henry VIII was still supposedly Catholic, but his stormtroopers did basically destroy this entire culture in England, particularly. So all the monasteries and convents and so on, which had been places for retreat for men and women, were given to his mates, and they're now the stately homes. So we go to the Port Eliot Festival in St Germans. It has a cathedral in the garden, and a massive house. Well, that used to be a monastery or a convent of some kind. The Cambridge colleges used to be, the college I went to, Jesus, was a convent in the sort of 12 to 1300s. So some of them were turned into places of learning. And basically that whole culture was taken away. There was a massive homeless problem because all the nuns and monks were sort of turned out onto the streets. Not only that, but these charitable institutions no longer existed, so they couldn't look after the beggars. So there was a huge Tudor beggar homeless problem and a new crackdown on idling. So the 17th century was, really bad. 16th, 17th century was a really bad time for idlers. They were called vagabonds or masterless men. They were sort of roaming around the country without a job. They would try and get them to work, and if they escaped and went back on the road again and became idlers, and they were caught a second time, they would have a V branded on them. Now, this is not a million miles away from what happened much later in Nazi Germany, when, and not to the same brutal extent, but which happens a little bit today with dole sheets, and in Nazi Germany, as well as Jews, homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses and so on, all these groups who didn't fit in were rounded up and put into labour camps. There was another group called the Idlers, or the do-nothings, and they had a black triangle sewn onto their outfits because they persistently refused offers of work. Okay, so that's not a million miles away to what the Tudors were doing, and they invented something called houses of correction, where people would be sent and sort of trained into the sort of ways of righteousness. You can see the battle between the old ways and the new ways in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. I mentioned this in one or two of my books. So you have the figure of Malvolio. Does anyone remember it? Malvolio means bad wishing in Latin. And he's hanging around at the court. He's trying to get off with Olivia, or Viola, Olivia, the queen or whatever she is. But there are these other people living in the house, the medieval characters, Sir Toby Belch and Maria. They're constantly drinking and shouting and having late night parties. And Malvolio comes down and tells them to turn the music down. And they say, "Who is this guy?" And Maria says, "Oh, he's one of these Puritans. Have you heard this phrase, Puritan?" And I think Twelfth Night was written in something like 1600, 1605, something around then. So that shows you that these Puritans were coming in, and they're very much against fun. And the old-fashioned medieval. And the Protestant work ethic came in. Life is about hard work. Okay, it's not about charity. It's not about showing how good you are. Life becomes about hard work and becomes about hard work as an individual. Now, this is a bit of a breakneck speed. Under Cromwell, we had a Commonwealth, which is a bit like a sort of Leninist, communist, Stalinist Commonwealth. Christmas, the first thing they did was ban Christmas, our lovely old-fashioned 12 Days festival. I think I mentioned before, they took down all the maypoles and they closed the theatres. They did also, I think, ban bear baiting. But theatres, maypoles, drinking, fornicating, all these things that we used to really enjoy were sort of more or less sort of banned. But there'd been, although the medieval system had been corrupt, it was also quite fun and lax on these sorts of things. It was quite sort of morally liberated in a way. And so for 15 years, it was actually illegal in this country to celebrate Christmas. Christmas is seen as hopelessly old-fashioned, superstitious, popish, belonging to the old world. Why is it even still here? It's just it's crazy. Like the way some people might think about horoscopes, just absolutely daft. That's what they thought of Christmas. People continue to celebrate it illegally, secretly. They had secret raves, underground Christmas parties. There were anti-Christmas police who went around busting up these Christmas parties, and he would ask you things like, "Do you like mince pies?" And that was a trick question. Mince pie, because a mince pie had a little sort of idolatrous image on the top of a Christ in a manger or something like that. They were seen as also popish and old-fashioned. So, do you like mince pies? If you said yes, then that was like a sign that you weren't with the new Protestant religion. So it was pretty brutal. I wanted to mention Isaac Walton though, because there were people who resisted this. The dominant move of Cromwell and the Puritans was that we should be working hard, we should get up early, and we should sort of avoid fun at all costs. So there was an anti-idling movement. But there were little resistances to it. I'll just briefly mention Isaac Walton, who wrote the the Complete Angler. Yeah, thanks. Which was like, it's supposed to be one of the best-selling. People say it's a better seller than the Bible, but it's certainly a massive best-selling book and was at the time. And it's ostensibly a guide to fishing, but he says, us fishermen, we love doing nothing. We love contemplation. We like the contemplative life rather than the active life. There are stained glass windows of him in Winchester Cathedral, I think, studied to be quiet, picture of him fishing, doing nothing. And he talks about the Puritans. And the thing is about the Puritans as well, they were the new capitalists. So the ban on usury, which I mentioned, had been lifted by Calvin and Luther. You could now, capitalism was sort of liberated into a new phase, which was amazing in some ways. You could sort of do more what you wanted. But what happened in this country was that we actually got fed up with the Puritans. Charles II came back to the throne, and he was utterly different from Cromwell. So Cromwell had actually banned colourful clothes. You had to wear very plain, sort of brown-type clothes. As I said, it banned all the old feast days. So the Protestants, they closed down all these old feast days because they thought they were idolatrous. So there was no break. There was no, just work, work, work all year round. But Charles II came back to the throne, and we can all picture him. He had long curly hair. He was completely different. He was like, "Come on, let's have a party." Nell Gwynn was his mistress. He had loads of mistresses. It was like a sort of sensual court. He was called the Merry Monarch, and that Merry is a very medieval word. And he reopened the theatres. Daniel Defoe counted something like 600 maypoles going back up in the later 1600s. So where did the Puritans go? So although we were sort of largely Protestant, we were making a lot of concessions towards the old fun. The Puritans then got fed up and were banished or left this country and went to America on the Mayflower and went to Boston, where they could start their new Puritan colony without interference from these old-fashioned sort of popish, whatever, medieval people. And it was called America, and it's been a very successful country. But the Americans, it's like Little House on the Prairie. Like, think about the American church and the simple singing that they did. Singing as well was sort of the old-fashioned polyphony, the beautiful medieval choirs singing Eternity for like hours, and the insect, that was all out. So it was like, "My eyes have seen the coming of the glory of the Lord," and in a little sort of simple wooden shack, all buttoned up and simple. Quakers are kind of Puritans, and some historians think that this Puritanism laid the foundations for the new sort of form of capitalism that emerged in the later 18th century. So I'm going to try and wind up quickly because I've been going on far too long. So in the later 18th century comes a new revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And this is a revolution of industry against idleness. So although we've seen one revolution in terms of the Puritan Revolution, it's gone a little bit backwards with Charles II, and we're still basically an agrarian population before the Industrial Revolution. In the 18th century, rooms like this, Dr. Johnson, there's a vibe of like fun again, actually. And you can spend time writing and reading and thinking. There's a new form of journalism appears with people like, Addison and Steele, The Spectator, The Tatler, The Observer, The Rambler, and so on. And the 18th century is quite fun. Boswell's constantly shagging prostitutes in St. James's Park and this sort of thing. So there seems to be a sort of loosening of the morals, if you like. But then we get the Industrial Revolution, which is, the rise of machinery. We resist it. The Luddite resistance is quite a sophisticated resistance. They break the frames, but frame breaking is made an offence punishable by being hanged. And the state does indeed hang, 10 or 15 young men, 15-year-olds, for breaking up the frames, or they're deported to Australia. So this new Industrial Revolution is pushed through, and obviously a new form of capitalism emerges where you can buy a machine and employ people full-time. So people move from maybe a more precarious but a sort of agrarian existence where you've got your own sheep and your own cow and you've got some kind of small holding, you do bits of craft and you sell it and this sort of thing. And now you've got to go, there's a 9 to 5, there's a new kind of work ethic. Now certainly in the first half of the 19th century, this is horrific. I mean, Dickens writes about it. People are working 14, 16 hours a day. in these mills. Laissez-faire capitalism allows it to happen. It's only in 1947, I think, that we get the first reaction against it, which is the 10 hours a day act, limiting the working day to 10 hours Monday to Friday and 8 hours on a Saturday. So before that, the capitalists have been allowed to do what they want, a bit like the gig economy. You just work all day. So this is a huge setback for idling. Plenty of poets write about it. William Blake, obviously, the dark satanic mills, and he hates this new system. At the same time, Wordsworth and Coleridge are saying, come on, get out of the countryside, because we're now being put into towns. Get out of the countryside, like do nothing and be a poet. So the reaction against this system carries on through the 19th century. We end up with, Marxism, obviously, as a reaction against it as well. I mentioned Dickens, Kropotkin and the anarchists, a whole new political movement, the rise of the trade unions, which is a kind of a guild. And the trade unions are saying, look, we've got to make the working day shorter again. So this is quite a positive move, really, as far as idling goes. There are also public libraries. So there's a reaction against it, and there's a lot of Victorian do-gooding as well. Public parks, swimming pools, some public amenities, fountains, and this kind of thing. So a little sort of nod back. And I suppose one of the great ones of the 19th century would be Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde says, look, let's look back at the ancient Greeks. Life is not all about hard work and hard toil. In the old days, you used to be the aristocrats were embarrassed if they had to earn money, if they had to get a job. They're embarrassed to admit that, because the highest point of civilization should be leisure. And in fact, in the States in the early 20th century, places like Kellogg's were bringing in a shorter working day. The mainly female workers had demanded it because they could have a sort of 3 or 4 day working week, spend more time with their family, perhaps earn a little bit less, but it was worth it, because you had more time. And then that actually got derailed in the 1930s because of the Great Depression. And since then, the working day has gone up and down. Although today's sort of capitalists or Tories laugh at the 70s. Who wants to go back to the 1970s? The 3-day week. I sort of think that was quite good. The 3-day week when you could only work 3 days a week. And because by the way, idling is good for the planet. Consumption went right down, and what we would call emissions, but energy use. Obviously, if there's a 3-day week, you do less, you consume less. Busyness, hypercharged capitalist work ethic, likes you doing stuff and being really, really busy, whatever it is. And that activity uses up energy, fossil fuels, whatever. So energy actually sort of went down during the 3-day week. And I'm really fascinated to see that the Labour Party is bringing back some of these ideas. I mean, Lenin in the 20s was very, very against laziness. And he called it Oblomovism, because there was a famous Russian novel called Oblomov about an incredibly lazy Russian aristocrat who did nothing. But it's a lovely book, and he's quite an attractive character. He doesn't see the point in working. He has a boring job, but he gets a doctor's note. And he says, when am I supposed to live with this boring job for the government that I'm supposed to do? But Lenin said this was Oblomovism, people living off their land, not working, not contributing. And so the communist thing obviously was about hard work. In Animal Farm, hard work, frugality, hard work, frugality. We will build our new Jerusalem. Not much time for religion. Which gave people days off, and it also gave them some transcendent moments, possibly. So life becomes much more kind of boring in a way, utilitarian. Life's just about sort of hard work. The punk movement in the 1970s brought back a lot of the cynics' ideas, in the sense of the cynical philosophers of ancient Greece, who lived in barrels, masturbated in public, gate-crash parties, refused to work, dressed in rags, and this sort of thing, and fought against convention. And Johnny Rotten said, we don't work, we just feed, that's all I need. That was the phrase from Nevermind the Bollocks album. And that's a direct restatement of ancient Greek cynical philosophy. So these are, punks were not into working. And the Clash said, career opportunities, I won't open a letter bomb for you. So they were anarchists in the sense that they saw work, in many cases, for many people, not everybody, in many cases a kind of luxurious form of slavery, where you're working for someone else and your time is taken away. So that there was a sort of re-idling. And Lennon brings back a lot of these ideas too in the Beatles. So Lennon has lots of pro-idling songs. Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream. Everybody seems to think I'm lazy. I don't mind, I think they're crazy. Running everywhere at such a speed till they find there's no need. I'm only sleeping. Watching the wheels go round and round, which is another sort of pro-idling song. I'm so tired. I'm not sure that he's happy being tired, but so there's a lot of these ideas again come back through pop music. The bare necessities is a statement of again, you know, sort of Stoic or Epicurean, basically Epicurean philosophy. You don't need that much, and sort of God will provide. That's also what Christ said in the Sermon on the Mount. So bringing this up to date, what can I say? I mean, I don't really know where we are now. But when I started the magazine, originally it was in the early 90s, and I wanted to create a magazine that, you know, brought people together who wanted something more out of life than just money earning and doing a job that you didn't really enjoy just to get money, and you know, what was the point of all this? Things seem to have gone backwards a little. I mentioned Elon Musk. You know, the digital revolution seems to. It seemed great, like mobile phones, computers. This is amazing. I can work wherever I like. But now you're tethered to the boss, like sort of 24/7, and you have this kind of mobile office in your pocket, and you can actually work. When I had a smartphone, I remember thinking, "This is great. I can work while I'm walking along the street now." You know, even walking along the street, or a train ride used to be a lovely break from work. You could stare out the window and sort of nod off. Even going to the loo, you know, you can't do any more. It's not a break. I mean, I remember having a job like which I hated, and going to the loo was like, oh, this is great. This is my little moment of peace. If you've got your smartphone, then you know you can continue to work while you're going to the loo. I mean, it's absolutely mad. So what I want to, the point really of these two lectures, the last one and this one, is just to show that things haven't always been like this, and the Protestant work ethic is something that was actually invented quite recently. There are other attitudes to life and work, and you can actually see them when you go to other countries too. Different countries have different attitudes to work, and you know, the southern European countries seem to be less work focused. I mean, in Italy, people don't ask you what you do; they sort of talk about food and la bella figura and how to live life well. That sort of carries on.